Can you see the board, anybody? As you can see, I've already done the board work. So as I read my notes, we can interact and use it as a chart if you like. And then can you see what it says?
Yes, we can see.
Can you see?
It's not completely clear, but I think most of it's readable.
Most of it's readable because when I look at my screen, it's not actually readable. I look at my computer.
Yeah, some of it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I wasn't quite sure what to draw on the board or how to make it more visual. You know what I'm like, I do read from my notes. So what I've done is drawn up these two lines on the board that I want to discuss. This study it's kind of last minute, so I haven't got any new research to discuss today, or I just want to discuss the lines and how they may look in our time. So please interact. That would be really good. So we probably remember Elder Tess talking us through the book Spiritual Gifts and its chapter headings, which some are on the board under the correct waymarks, and we can see if you can see what they say. I think Elder Dominda has gone through these books also in a French camp meeting, but I can't remember. So Elder Tess went through the Great Controversy also in this way. Spiritual gifts, as we know, was for Ellen G. White to prepare the church for the loud cry and the close of probation. And the Great Controversy was prepare the church for 1880 Sunday law and the coming together of church and state. Now, if there's anything you don't agree with or I'm getting wrong, please interrupt me, and because we're all in this together, and this is quite a long time ago, so and because I did this quite quickly, we all need to have a bit of a refresher. What was happening running up to 1888? Does anybody know? The answer's on the board, obviously. Kind of. Don't worry about getting the wrong answer. We're all trying to learn, so it's not a problem. What was happening running up to 1888 history, 1888 history?
Well, I guess going from what you have on the board, it says playable, but we recognize that leading up to that was a struggle in America to define it in some shape or form as a Christian nation.
Really good point. Yeah. And there was warnings of a Sunday law in Congress, wasn't there? This is what A.T. Jones was fighting against. But does anyone want to explain a little bit more about the Blair Bill? It's 1888. No? Senator Blair proposed the first Sunday law bill to the 50th Congress, advocating to secure to the people the enjoyment of the first day of the week, which was known as the Lord's Day, as a day of rest, and to promote its observance as a religious worship. Any questions about any of that I've just said, or the history of 1888? And the two books I've got here on the board, Spiritual Gifts, The Great Controversy, how I've laid it out. Okay, moving on. So an important waymark on the line of the priest using the 126 takes us to where? Anybody?
Takes us to 2014.
The 126 takes us to 2014. That's, yeah, but where else does it take us? I'm sure it takes us to another waymark that's on the board.
Clear, I may be wrong in that.
Hi, Natalie.
Yeah, hi.
Isn't
Who's
that it's Marshall?
What were you going to say?
Did you say where does the 126 take us from 1863?
I was wondering what do we remember what took us 1880 waymark, 1888? If I'm quite wrong.
Okay, because I thought Curtis was meant to speak about 1989.
Yeah, I think
Was your question
What
about
text?
1863 or 1888?
1888.
Oh, okay. Sorry for that.
Was there anything that took us to that waymark? Took us from 2014 to 1888. Am I correct in saying that?
You asked about where does the 126 take us, so I think that's why Curtis said 2014. And you
Yeah.
said, well, that wasn't that seemed to be not the one you were looking for, but that's the one.
No, I think I'll stick with that. I'm getting mixed up. So yeah, the 126 to 2014.
But there is another one from 1980 to 1989, isn't there? From 1863. So yeah.
Yeah.
So both people were right.
Yes. So 2014, like Curtis mentioned, was an important for the priests. Yes, it was their Sunday law and a warning of what the great test will look like. What is our great test, by the way? Oh no. What is the great test for God's people? Or shall I say, when is it? So we don't know the date, but
Are you talking about agenda or equality, or you talking about?
Oh yeah, that is the great test, is about gender. But it's Daniel 11, verse 41, isn't it? That's the Sunday law test. Am I correct? We know it's about gender. We agreeing on that, or we disagreeing?
No, I agree on that.
Right. So what did we see in 2014? We saw a landmark case, Hobby Lobby. That was actually first brought to court in 2012, as I mentioned in my last study about religious liberty prevailed in the Supreme Court case. I mentioned that. We also saw many things happen in 2014 related to the priest Sunday law waymark. Elder Tess went through a long list of those things in a presentation, didn't she? Besides what Elder Tess has already mentioned, we had also major issues in 2014 with immigration, with a surge of unaccompanied women and children crossing borders from the Northern Triangle of Central America. And additionally, we had the UN said that 2014, the world was confronted with the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II, with millions fleeing their country. And we also had an outbreak of the deadly Ebola virus in 2014, which prompted governments around the world to regulate travel bans from within West Africa, as well as bans, airports, health screening, closing borders, travel quarantine were among the policies implemented with in 2014 with regards to Ebola virus. So as 2014, like 2014 in 1888 history, it wasn't just one thing happening, such as the Blair Bill and bringing in the Sunday law. It was a complicated history, and it was also about controlling immigration, rewriting the Constitution. If the Protestants would have just brought in the bill of the Sunday law, they would have failed in their objectives because it was more complicated than that, just like ours will be. Any questions? So we know in 1888 what A.T. Jones was writing about. As I said, it was complicated. He wrote about all things in Congress, what Congress was doing, all the things that was happening in politics in the United States. So our church back then could be prepared for what was a complicated events heating up in that time period. and what Ellen G. White describes, I think, in The Great Controversy, or in her quotes, the movements in progress with regard to the Sunday law and church and state. The Great Controversy was what Ellen G. White wrote, as I said, to prepare the church for 1888, this history. And the spiritual gifts in 1858, I think, was to prepare, as I said, was to prepare the church for the loud cry and the second advent, which most probably, I think, we think it would have been 1863 here. I'm not sure if we agree on that. So as we know, the movements now in progress today, in our time, have nothing to do with the issue of Sunday over Sabbath. We know, unfortunately, that the Adventist Church doesn't believe or recognise 1989 of this movement. So what waymark is on the board would they go back to or hang on to for the Sunday law in the future? Anyone know? What would they be looking at? What are they waiting for? What waymark? What's the last waymark the Adventists in history they would hold on to?
Would you say it's 1888?
Yeah, okay, that's definitely it. That's the last waymark they have. So for every Adventist that hasn't entered this movement, this 1888 waymark is all they have right now. So they consider their present and their future based on everything they read on 1888 history, don't they? The only visibility they have in 1888 history was the Sunday law in Congress and what A.T. Jones was talking about. Any comments or any?
Well, are they getting that 1888 waymark? Because obviously they don't study prophecy, so are they getting that from the Great Controversy?
Yeah, and they're getting it from all the history the history of the Millerites and Ellen White and A.T. Jones. They're getting it from A.T. Jones, aren't they, and all that.
No, I mean, I'm talking about the SDA Church itself. I mean, we know that from the Millerites, but where they get in their 88 waymark, if we're looking at Adventists today, they're not going to say we're getting it from the Millerites, are they? They're going to say they're getting it from the Great Controversy.
Yeah, but it's the same thing, isn't it? Ellen White, I know she was 1850, but you know, it's still they. So I guess what you're trying to say, Debs, is that they don't really believe in a lot of what went on,
Yeah,
chart.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The Sunday law and the Great Controversy, I guess. Yeah. Anyone want to add to that?
Is it accurate to say that they don't believe in that history?
I'm not sure. I think a lot. I wouldn't say don't believe in the history, but they've rejected a lot, haven't they, from that history?
Like what?
Well, they rejected the charts. They rejected it's not a lot of the reforms. A lot of Adventists are not, doing. I know some conservatives doing the reforms, but what else have they rejected? 2520. Anyone else want to add something that they've rejected?
Well, they don't believe in the pioneers. They don't read the stuff of the pioneers either, do they?
I suppose it's a mix.
Yeah.
I think when we consider the Adventist Church as an institution, this is me just airing what's on my mind. Anyone feel free to correct me, but I think it's important to accurately depict what it is they have, what it is our differences are with them as. Like, from my understanding, when we look back at that history, where the institution would look back at that history, would see that it happened, but where we differ is how we interpret those things and the knock-on effect of what they have for us today. So I know that we make pretty candid statements like they rejected pioneers or etc., but they still study the pioneers' writings. They still look into those things, but where we differ is how we understand the intent and how it relays down into our history and etc. So it's not
Yeah.
that they just wiped away the pioneers' writings, for example.
Thanks, Curtis. So you remember Elder Tess talking about spiritual gifts, great controversy, going through the chapters. We know God through the Midnight Cry message has shown us that we have to take principle from our Alpha history, which was slavery, and 1880 history, which was many issues, as I've said. I'm not saying it wasn't, the 1880 history wasn't about Sunday, but it was more complex than that. So we take both and make application what that looks like for our dispensation. And as I said, the great controversy, as we know, has to be read in the same way we read spiritual gifts, because both histories are talking about current movements in progress back then for them. So like our Midnight Cry message said, we would have to see cotton plantations as well if you want to say we will have a literal Sunday law about Sunday over Sabbath. As we know, God said, however we understand 1888 and interpret it has to be how we interpret 1850, which we know Adventists cannot do that today.
Natalie, can I just add something that Elder Parinda's put? He put the church rejected the charts and the 2520 in that history. Why is it so surprising that the church rejects those things now?
Thank you. Didn't see there was a message. Who's that question to?
No, that was what Elder Parinda wrote.
Yeah, I was discussing what we just discussed before. It was Curtis, was it?
Yes.
I think the wording's not that clear. There's a word missed out, but I think it's not a question. I think it's a statement. I think it's saying probably, so why is it surprising? I'm not sure, but so why is it surprising they rejected today when they rejected all that back then?
Yeah.
I think I wanted to make a comment on that. I think it's linking to what you're saying about how we understand 1888 and 1850 is that it's we've got the same writings and people would profess to believe those writings, especially conservative circles, but it's how readest thou, which I think is where perhaps Curtis was coming from. They don't profess to reject it, even the pioneer writings, but it's how they see those things, and it's how we used to see it. You know, it's all glorified, that history. It went to Congress. There was going to be a national Sunday law, you know, with 1888, and then in the Millerite history, it was all glorious. There were thousands of people in the message. You know, the whole way we used to view it is how they still see it, and they're focused on the fact that we're still waiting for Sunday. They're looking at the Pope. They're looking in the wrong direction because they haven't got that present truth understanding of dispensational reading and parable teaching to enable them to interpret the events correctly. So they can be reading the same books, and that's the same with, you know, evangelical Christianity. They've got the same Bible, but we know that, like in that slavery history, they could interpret it to have slaves or not to have slaves, depending on how they read it. So it's just amazing how we have the same material, and however much material we have loads of it, lots of spirit prophecy, that it doesn't matter if you've got the wrong glasses on, if you're not reading it from the right perspective.
Yeah, thanks for Emma. Anything else? That's why I think it was good when Elder Tess said how they read the great controversy about Sunday law. They have to also, and they say, you know, we're going to see a Sunday law, you know, Sabbath, Sunday law. And when she mentioned we'd have to see then cotton plantations, I thought it was really brilliant. So yeah, like you said, Emma, they're not taking both histories, they're not reading correctly.
No, we definitely missed the slavery one as well. And I think that's, if we can show somebody that about spiritual gifts, it can show that the sins of Babylon was slavery in that time period in 1850. If you can show that, like you've got on the board, then you can bring it to 1888 and say, look, it's the same history, it's a different test in this dispensation. Therefore, when it comes down to our dispensation, it's not going to be the same, but we're not talking about the same events in our time.
And Emma, could it also be the way that the books were written? Because we know that spiritual gifts was written first, and then we know that great controversy was written last.
Yeah, definitely. So you see that progression in her life, don't you? Even that the test.
I mean, how the Adventists sort of, that's probably why they hang on to the great controversy, because the point I'm trying to bring out is that they wrote the spiritual gifts first, and then they wrote the great controversy last, rather than going back to the other book and the date and taking the date that it was written. I think there was some confusion or misunderstanding of why they've taken the great controversy as gospel now rather than spiritual gifts. I think it was the way that it was written, the dates that it was written, or rather than going back. If you see what the point I'm trying to make out. Anyway.
I think, thanks, Debbie. I think also, we still have Sunday law, we still have slavery, but what does that look like? And that's what we've been saying. What was one of their main current movements already in progress in 1850? What's happening here? Before 1850. I mean, slavery's been going on for a long time when we get here. What's going on here?
You
Are
mean
you talking
abolition?
about from 1844 to 1850, or just the 1850 mark?
It's before 1850. What was the current movements going on? I've already said it, and it's on the board. So it was the spread of slavery through American states. And in 1888, the movements was bringing in about the Sunday law, wasn't it, in Congress and church and state relationship and other things. Another point, do we believe the Millerites were reading newspapers this time? I believe they were. Not here, but probably leading up to 1850. To see the loud cry and the close of probation, I think they were. There had to be to see slavery, their test. Well, when Ellen White describes the sins of Babylon, I think some things I believe she was shown by an angel, and the rest was probably reading the newspapers. It is public external knowledge, how they see what is going on externally in politics. They're waiting for their election cycles. One side is pro-slavery and one side is anti-slavery. And they took a strong stand with Abraham Lincoln, didn't they? Back in 1888, most of the work of A.T. Jones, I think, was also a lot reading newspapers to know the movements that were in progress running up to 1888. Before the 1882, there was a lot going on about Sunday law. So would we agree that they were reading the newspapers like we do also?
Hello, Natalie.
Hi,
I think
I can't hear you, sorry. Could you speak up or get closer to the mic?
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, who is that? That's Simba.
Yeah. I think it's my suggestion. I think the Millerites ignored the external events, which is the reason why their history is the history of failure. They ignored the external events. They did not look much into the newspapers like what we are doing right now. That's what I think.
What about, well, how did they go with Abraham Lincoln then externally with regards to slavery? They must have been looking externally at the election cycles, what was going on, don't you think?
Personally, I think they were on the wrong side of the issue about that.
I think they were on the right side with regards to slavery because they were against it, weren't they?
I think they could
Yeah.
say, go on.
What do you say, Simba?
Come again, Natalie, what did you say?
Well, they were on the right side of the issue because Ellen White was against slavery. So they were siding with Abraham Lincoln, that it was wrong.
Yeah, Ellen White, she wrote about slavery against it, but they did not look into it. At corporate level, I think the Millerites did not check it, did not go on the right side of the issue. That's what I think.
I think what you're saying is the majority, but I think the Millerites, as in Ellen White and those pioneers, then I think they did go on the right side of the issue. But I think maybe you're saying that a lot back then didn't, and that's why the Civil War came. Emma, what was you saying?
I was going to agree with Simba. I don't think they read the newspapers like we are now. I think if you start Googling, if you start looking at Ellen White's writings about the news, it's all negative. It's negative. Reading newspapers is worldly and sinful. So I think they had that concept of the world being separate, and they thought obviously in 1844 the world was coming to an end anyway, so what's the point in getting involved with the politics? But I think with the slavery question, they're morally against it, so they are writing pamphlets about slavery and against it to abolish it. So they're definitely sending things into the South. They're distributing literature to the point where I think they got banned from doing that, but they were not following, I don't think they were following political events like we are. And I think we've made that distinction in the past, that they didn't have a clue. Well, they weren't clued up to external events being part of their story in that sense. So they were definitely against slavery, and they could see the Civil War coming, but they were more concerned with the draft, for instance, how it affected them personally on an individual level. Their sons were going to go to war now. It seems that's the thrust of it, as opposed to any political.
Okay. I thought Elder Tess mentioned that she was obviously were watching politics because of siding with Abraham Lincoln, and that he was right. But maybe I'm wrong in that. So today, meaning in 1989 to now, we have entered a new reform line. So those movements are not in progress. Sunday law, and slavery. At least they are meant to look like back then. We know Adventists are holding on, as I said, to Ellen G. White quotes with regards to the 1808 history. And just like I mentioned, they're not taking the movements of the Alpha, history, slavery, because then they would have that question, as I said, the quotes with regards to literal Sunday law. They couldn't really use that because while they're using slavery, we know there are no Sunday laws like in the 1880 history currently now in progress. So I'll just summarise. I don't mean that finish. I'll just go over what we talked about, see if anyone's got any questions. So
Natalie, sorry, just one thing. I'm just looking at writings from the biography. There is I know this is by Arthur White, so it's not by Ellen White, but he says that about the presidential election of Abraham Lincoln. He talks about it. Sabbath-keeping Adventists had no sympathy with slavery and were aware, of course, of the tensions and excitement that attended the presidential campaign of 1860, which led to the election of Abraham Lincoln, but they had kept quite aloof from matters relating to the political situation. Lincoln would take office on March 4th, 1861. He was known for his anti-slavery stance, and his election had led to considerable unrest in the southern states. So he makes the point that Adventists had kept aloof from the political situation in that history. Just wanted to add that in.
I agree with what Simba said and what you're saying there, but what I was saying is they were on the side of Abraham Lincoln, and they were aware of political things that were going on. I think Ellen White was anyway, but I mean, we're all guessing, aren't we? But that's a very good quote that you just read out. Thanks, Emma. Any questions about that, anyone, before I move on? So to summarise, we've already mentioned 2014, there were many things in progress looking back. Yes, it was the pre-Sunday law, but also we know it was a forewarning of the great test of Sunday law, Daniel 11:40. It's ahead of us, and what it will kind of look like. Just like in 1880 history, the years just before 1880, there was a Sunday law warning. So maybe that's something to ponder on as we look at things now in progress, and maybe we can begin to agree what the future Sunday law will look like. Sure, it's about abortion. I think women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, especially trans rights, and we're starting to see other issues also with immigration. Any questions like that? We know in 1888, those fighting for the Sunday law were trying to protect their Christian nation, and that's what Curtis brought out earlier. But we know they're not trying to protect it anymore using Sunday. Back then, they were trying to protect it using bringing in Sunday law. Now they're trying to protect it via discrimination, towards women and LGBTQ plus, and using religious liberty and freedom, which I talked about last week. So tracing the movements like they were doing in the past with these two reform lines, 1850 and 1888, we should be able to agree that the movements, this movement has been tracing the movements in progress in the United States also. So if an actual Sunday law would have happened in 1888, Elder Tess said she didn't think it would have been one law or one event. It would have been multiple events. And I would say it would have been multiple laws. It had to be because they had multiple goals. For example, they wanted to control the Catholics, the Jews, immigrants, and change the constitution, and implement many laws regarding what you could or could not do on Sunday across the United States. That requires many things, many decisions, things that to be put into law. Anyone want to give an example of what, you know, the issues that would have been going on then, why they would have had to bring in different laws?
Because as you said, it wasn't just to tackle one aspect. And as much as I said it was a lead up into Christianizing the nation, I would say it was leading up to that event was shaping America in their vision, how they saw America should be run and how society should be organized. And so all the different elements that you mentioned, you know, the Catholic Church, immigrants, SDAs, Jews, etc., challenged their worldview of what America should look like. So in that history, they needed ways to shape it in their vision, basically.
Yeah.
So how did they understand the Constitution? Was it the same way too then?
Yeah, but I think they had to change the Constitution because of bringing in a Sunday law and forcing that upon all the people. That's church and state, isn't it? They wanted to rule with their religion and how they wanted America to work. Anyone else got any answers to that question?
It links to the document, doesn't it? How did the Constitution become Christian? I think it's the way that they've always interpreted it as a Christian nation, Protestant. I think if we look at the issues in that history, like you were saying about immigration and religion, there were two things I suppose going on there, but they're all connected to white Western male supremacy. So these men are mostly, so these issues are mostly all connected with the fact that most of those white men in power were British, white, English-speaking males who were Protestant, and they just want to hold the majority position. So they don't want Catholics because they're a minority. They don't want free thinkers because they're a minority, or Jews or SDAs. They're all minority groups because they want to keep the power in their hands. And that's the same today when we look at it. Nothing much has changed. It's just that the issue looks slightly different because of the who they're trying to stop. So now they're trying to stop the Mexicans or trying to stop the Muslims, different religion, minority group, again, not white, not English speaking, not male, etc. They are male obviously, but it's the white male being on top.
Yeah. And all the things like what businesses can do on Sunday, emergency services, people can do with their property on Sunday, immigrants, like you said, what they can do on Sunday and so forth. The Constitution would have had to been changed to make the United States a Protestant nation to control Catholics. It would have meant that many things would have had to be put in place in 1888 history to fulfill the Protestants' goals. And as you said, Emmett, it's the same today. The far right have many goals. We've already seen the overturning of Roe v. Wade and a woman's right to abortion in some states. Abortion is totally blocked with exception for rape, incest, or mother's life being at risk. We see what they are trying to do with abortion bill and stop that. Issues with LGBTQ+, especially trans, and what they're doing there. laws about what they can do and cannot do in schools, how they can educate. We've seen issues with religious liberty, making president, for example, the Lobby case and others. And as I mentioned on the last study, I think I mentioned the issues with immigration. So it's all a threat to their way of life, like what's working these days. Any questions? So as I just mentioned, I don't think that it's going to be as simple as the Conservatives have won and there will be just one law and then democracy will be over. I think as I said before, to be honest, I don't believe democracy will fall for sure in this dispensation anyway. And Elder Commander gave us a good reason for that in the agitation of the Sunday law discussion that Debbie presented. But I do believe we need to ponder on what democracy will become or what it looks like. And I say that because the evidence for it is in 1888, as it is a much broader fight for the girls, the presidents. And remember, 1888 was like 2014, it was part of an escalation towards a more heated conflict, which we call the Sunday law of Daniel 11, verse 41. I think it was Ellen White that said the mindset behind slavery will not change, or was it James White? She said, I'm sure Ellen White would have agreed. That's why I said we have to interpret what slavery looks like in our time. So the abuse, the form of abuse will change. The form of slavery will change. So if you connect the whole history of the US and trace the problems that never went away and connect Millerite history to our own, if you cut the line and overlay them, and you connect the sins of Babylon in 1888, the Sunday law, and the coming together of church and state, in 1850s history, the sins of Babylon, as I said, slavery, we must then apply slavery, as I said, to our time. So in our history, we should by now know what slavery looks like. Does anyone want to say what slavery looks like in our time? Any ideas? Do you know what slavery looks like in our time? I think it's oppression, isn't it, and taking away certain individual rights of women, LGBTQ, and other minorities. Is that you, Emma?
Yeah, I was thinking when you said about the mindset of slavery not changing, I think that's parallel in the movement, but in the fact that, or the Israelites' mindset that they did it away with outward idolatry when they left, when they went into captivity of Babylon. We know that history, that they were cured of outward idols, and yet their mindset had not changed. By the time they get to Christ's time, they still got the mindset of Apis Bull. And I think that's part of our problem today, that we're cured of the outward many things, but not the inward. So outwardly we've rejected. Sorry, just hold on a second.
I'll carry on.
So I think, sorry, Natalie, got distracted there, is the fact that the mindset of many of us probably hasn't changed, that we are outwardly professing equality and to do away with the patriarchal headship system. And physically we might be making changes outwardly, but inwardly I don't think we've severed ourselves from that, you know, seeing God as a male, seeing the whole patriarchal system as negative, as the worst sin ever, headship, as, you know, that we still haven't fully, engaged with that on a mental, emotional level. I think we're still fighting to change that, and we're holding on to just like the Israelites were holding on to Apis Bull. I think we haven't shifted our mindset into full equality, because obviously it's a progression, we're trying to do that, but I think
What's that got to do with slavery? Can you just explain to me, because I said, what does slavery look like in our time?
Yeah, it's the fact that we haven't really, inculcated this oppression. So people would say in America, why are you going on about black people? Because we've done away with slavery. They're not slaves anymore. There is equality. They can get jobs. They can do this. But there's that systemic, racism still there. It's not gone away. People's hearts haven't changed. You're never going to change the heart that deep down we're still white supremacy, or we're not treating people equally in our mindset internally with people in America.
We're still slaves, you mean?
Yeah, they're still slaves. They're still treated. They're still the underdogs. They don't have the opportunities. They're still prejudiced against. They don't. If we use that on the black level, we know that with women as well and LGBTQ. We know that externally, that's what it looks like. But internally, I don't know if we fully grasped that we've shifted our mindset, that we really do believe what we're saying, that because the whole world we're fighting the whole culture, and it's hard, and we're suffering. And it just reminds me of the Israelites. They come out of Egypt and they're hankering after the flesh pots of Egypt still. They're saying, we want the leeks and onions. We want to go back into slavery because it was more comfortable. We didn't get all this persecution in the wilderness like we get all these tribes attacking us, and it's hard out here. There's no water. And I think we've still got that, everybody out there, we don't want to look different from other women. We want to look beautiful like they want us to look. Or we as men want the power. We don't want to give up the headship patriarchal position. And it's because it's creating a rift in families. Marriages are splitting. The whole thing is painful and suffering, and we didn't factor that. So we're saying we want to go back to the flesh pots of Egypt. And I think many of us have got a foot in both camps. That's where we're struggling, because we haven't shifted that mindset. We're still in slavery and oppression, and we don't recognize how damaging it is. We're crippled like the black people coming out of slavery. They didn't know how to function in a free system. We don't know how to function without men being in charge. And both sides, male and female, don't want to do that for whatever reason. And I think it's because we're going against the whole culture of the world around us, and we want to be like the world. This is the Israelites' problem. They don't want to get rid of it because it's comfortable, and a change is hard.
Yeah, I was just going to say that Midnight Cry message was to free slaves in our time. And I think many people are still happy to be slaves. Thanks, Emma. As I've already mentioned, A.T. Jones was familiar with every event and every stepping stone towards the coming together of church and state and the proposed Sunday law in 1888. And so shall we be, seeing every stepping stone towards our great test. Do you agree that we are seeing every stepping stone towards our great test? It's okay if you disagree. Are we seeing every stepping stone towards our great test? I believe we are. Whatever was filling the United States cup in the past, the sins of Babylon, has to be taken as a parable as we know. Slavery today is oppression of minorities, I think, and the breakdown of the rights of women, LGBTQ+, and I would say it might include immigration. Severing ties of nature. You remember what that means? Anyone remember what that means? Severing the ties of nature. Midnight Cry Messenger mentioned that. What are the severing the ties of nature? So it's what's between people, isn't it? It's the connections of people, for example, mother, daughter, wife, husband, brother, sister. Severing the ties of nature is what and has been happening on the borders with separation of families. They're severing the ties of nature. As I mentioned, we saw issues in 2014, and we started to see that with the issues during the Trump administration, also with Bill Wall, separate parents from their children and families. I can't remember the guy's name who was involved and in charge of that. Name's gone off to my tongue, but some terrible things were happening in families, severing the ties of families. We've seen it recently with Biden's new immigration rule. It's still going on at the border. There was only talk about buses arriving yesterday, how bad it is. Biden's new immigration rule, I believe, ain't much different to what Trump's administration had, but don't quote me on that, because I researched it. Any comments?
Sorry, Natalie, what point are you making about that, severing the ties of nature?
I'm just saying that I think because we saw it in 2014 with immigration and all the issues there, I just think we saw it with Trump. I just think we're going to be seeing it again as we move forward. It's not something that's going to go away. And I think that they're still severing the ties of nature. They're still separating families. And there's still lots of issues with immigrants. What do you think?
Yeah, I was just wondering, you mentioned the movement in the sense of when Ellen White talks about, the fact that husbands and wives, children will sever the ties under the loud cry because nothing is powerful. Everything is powerless to stop them now, that they will take their stand for the message, regardless of what personal cost it is to them.
That the midnight cry as well, though.
Like, right, yeah, well, every level of becoming an Adventist, I suppose you could say, we all make choices about leaving our blood relatives to stand.
You're right though, loud cry.
What's that?
You're right though, the loud cry, that's true. I remember that quote, but midnight cry, loud cry, it's all the same, isn't it?
Anonymous, yeah. But I was thinking on another level how externally this is happening with the generations as well, that there's never been perhaps such a big severing between grandparents, parents, children, because of, I'm going to say artificial intelligence, but because of the internet, because of video games, because of the fact that, and this was addressed recently about, internet gods, basically gurus on the internet that are shaping the lives of our children more than parents and teachers. Whereas in the old days, obviously you only had the physical adults in your life that were going to influence you. Then we had television, and obviously that became, but it was limited, perhaps you could say, because there were certain length of time that children's programs were on, or whatever you could see. But now there's that 24/7 access to other voices in children's heads, especially. And so that difference now between what children know and what they can do technologically, as well as who they follow and who they listen to, is huge compared to what it was. So we have no longer got that parental control over them, which is a huge factor when it comes to spiritual things, because Ellen White talks about the parents being gods to the children, and we are the voice of God to the child when it's being raised. So they listen to you and respect you until they get to school and have teachers and other things. But even back then, teachers were God-fearing people, you could say. So that the whole culture was much more God-fearing, and now it's just become, culture has taken over, and that culture is really influencing our children in a way that's negative. To sever those connections, we don't have any, we're losing relationship because of iPhones and internet taking over, and people don't have proper communication with each other, even though there's all these communication methods. It feels like a satanic attack. That's parallel.
I agree, it's definitely severing ties, but I'm not sure if it, in the context Elder Tess brought it out, I'm not sure she was definitely talking about immigration. But yeah, I definitely see how it's severing the ties of families, the internet surely is. Thanks, Emma. So the Sunday law we've always believed is the coming together of church and state, with the church ruling the state, even though we have said church and culture recently. I think the issue may still look religious and patriarchal. Does anyone disagree with me? We know the test is about gender, not Sunday, and the root of it is culture's deep-rooted misogyny, sexism, and patriarchal control. In my opinion, the Sunday law is a failure to recognise minorities' rights. It was in 1850 with slavery, and in 1888 we forced everyone to a day of rest with regards to religion and church and state coming together. A.T. Jones said that the day didn't matter. In our history, it's similar. It's a failure to uphold rights of minorities.
Yeah.
Hi. Just a side point that I forgot. I put it on the board. I think I put it here. Can you read what this says here? The primary law, Compromise of the North and South, 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. Just want to mention that. So in 1850, we know there was a compromise between the North and the South with the bringing in of the Fugitive Slave Act. Anyone know what were the effects of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was? The effects. Yeah. But it's up there. So we know the law threatened the safety of all Black individuals, slave and free. However, it forced many Northerners to become more defiant in support of fugitives. Do we get that? I'll go on, you might understand what I'm trying to get at. So I just wanted to say, let's hope we have some defiance as much as the North, who didn't support slavery back then. Let's hope that we have that our great test of, you know, with supporting LGBTQ and women's rights and minorities. I think the compromise was about a series of bills that was passed. It was for those who were against slavery were to aid in catching fugitives. For example, if I was in the North and I was an abolitionist and didn't help catch a runaway slave, I could be punished by the government. I think that's what it's about. Can somebody, let me just see.
Marshall's written in the chat. Do you want me to read it, Natalie?
Yeah, I can read it out because for the video. Thank you.
The law created an environment where free slaves who fled to the North could be captured and returned back to the South.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Marshall.
Yeah. Were you saying from that those in the North who were against slavery, this kind of drove them to be more defiant and say, we're not doing that?
Yes, I'll tell you why. So the compromise was a series of bills, which I think is important. Compromise, series of bills. So even if you were against slavery, you were also, like Marsha said, you were forced to aid in the actions of slavery in violation of your own conscience. So you can support slavery in the hand because they forced you to, or in the forehead. So the Fugitive Slave Act did not succeed because many in the North refused to abide by it. As I said, they were defiant and supported fugitives. So for our day, if parts of the Sunday law look anything like we've just seen in Uganda recently, like, you know, like giving prison sentences to those promoting or supporting homosexuality, many of us may sadly fall and receive the mark of the beast in our hand. It's quite serious situation and absolutely devastating what's going on there. Got a comment, Emmy? You've said something a minute ago. Did I answer the question? Question. There, Emma?
Oh, sorry, ask me a question.
You mentioned something and I said I'll carry on reading, see if that helps. It's about, I've talked about the compromise and about people in the North who were defiant, and it was I think this act was unsuccessful because the North wouldn't abide by it.
They didn't abide by it. I think there was a lot of compromise on their part, though, towards slavery. Melania wrote in the chat, it gave the federal government the responsibility to find return slaves who tried to escape.
Yeah.
So there was a backlash against that, I suppose, saying, but at the same time, they were compromising a lot because of the whole annexation of, you know, Texas, and the fact that states wanted to join who were still slaveholders, and the whole economic situation meant that they were more open to this compromise with slavery. And I suppose that's the whole Henry Clay history about, you know, compromising over
failed,
states can join.
It failed. It did fail, I think, because of the North that didn't want to agree with slavery. I mean,
but they were very slow to move, and I think that's what Ellen White makes the point, that they were in trouble as well because they were not listening to God. They were compromising on money and financial economic reasons, and they were not taking a firm stand against slavery like they should have been. So that's why it took so long. So it didn't fail in one respect because it pushed the Civil War back to 60. I think the Civil War would have happened a lot earlier if they hadn't been.
I mean,
if they'd been stronger.
Like, yeah, a bit like the RIFRA, you know, I was talking about last week. It strengthened the First Amendment. I think the Fugitive Slave Act was actually a lot earlier, and then they brought this one in to try and strengthen what was going on. And I thought it was interesting that, you know, like you said, they were compromising, but I think the bills were a compromise as well, and they brought into law.
I mean, the Fugitive Slave Act itself was a compromise, wasn't it? They should not have ever agreed to that. And yeah, Melani's put the North Compromise because of financial reasons. Absolutely.
Thank you. Any questions about anything talked about so far? I'm going to sort of summarise now. So nearly up for an hour. So we talked about the book Spiritual Gifts in 1858 and how it was put under right to prepare the church for the loud cry and close probation, and how the great controversy was to prepare the church in the 1888 Sunday law and the covenant of together of church and state. We talked about what was happening in Congress in 1888 with the Blair Bill, and as I said, church and state coming together, and A.T. Jones was fighting all of that and many other things too. And I think I mentioned the 126, and I mentioned the 2014 being the Sunday law, and how it was forewarning, even though it's a proper Sunday law, it was also a forewarning of what Sunday law could look like in the future. Like 1888 was also forewarning or before that time. I mentioned how 2014 we saw the landmark case Hobby Lobby, that it was a victory of religious liberty, and how 2014 Sunday law was about many subjects, such as immigration, with the surge of unaccompanied women and children across the borders, what the UN said they were confronted with immigration in 2014, the crisis there. I mentioned the Ebola virus and the government were doing then about that. And we talked about what the last waymark Adventist history, what would they held on to, which was the Sunday Law Congress, wasn't it? The writings of A.T. Jones in 1888. And I mentioned they don't take both histories, and probably, of course, due to them not reading right, using the right correct methodology, they just stick with 1888. We talked about 1850 and the run up to 1888, both L.G. White and A.T. Jones, and whether they were looking at external events, and we came kind of to agreement on that, and how they kind of agreed with Abraham Lincoln and were against slavery, and White was against slavery. We talked about A.T. Jones knew every stepping stone towards the Sunday law and the coming together of church and state, and as I mentioned, we should be seeing how the cup, the sins of Babylon, are being filled in our time in the USA now. Lastly, we mentioned, I mentioned the severing of ties of nature, basically about families being separated, and how I've seen this in the past, and we probably continue to see that in the future. I mentioned as a side point just a minute ago about the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which was a compromise between the North and the South. And as I said, I think the compromise was about a series of bills as well as all the other things that I mentioned about Melina and Emma. I talked about how if you were in the North and you were an abolitionist and didn't want to catch runaway slaves, you could have been punished by the government for that. And as I mentioned, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 failed due to defiance of the North not wanting to abide in the Act. And I mentioned that the far great test includes anything like Uganda's recent horrendous law against LGBTQ. How, if that was happening to us at our great test, how would we deal with that, and would we fail and take the mark of the beast fear? Any questions or comments about the whole presentation? Anything you don't understand, disagree with? Do you understand the line of spiritual gifts, the book here, and what was happening in 1850, Great Controversy, 1888, Blair Bill, Sunday law, to come together church and state, how taking them both, if we were going to take the Sunday law, we'd have to take slavery as well, which Adventists don't do. And then I mentioned about we still will see slavery. We still do see slavery. It just looks different. The abuse has changed. And Sunday law, we know, is all about gender and the abuse against minorities and women. Any questions?
I think it's a good point about, you know, it's very complex in these histories. It's much more complex than just summarizing it by slavery and Sunday law in those two histories, which is what you've said. And I think that's good to know in our history, because we always want to simplify things. Parable methodology teaches us to go from the known to the unknown, and this whole simplifying it by just saying it's gender equality. But we've made the connections between gender equality and a right-wing dictatorship, you know, in those countries in the world who are right-wing dictatorships now, and that polarization between left and right, and we recognize the pitfalls on both, but we see the general trend of the world going still down that, you know, sexist, misogynistic, anti-LGBTQ, anti-minority groups. So we can see clearly that subject of the Sunday law, gender equality, in the politics in the world, because of the way we've been taught, I suppose, to look at these things now and recognize the complexity of it at the same time. It's a base issue. Yeah, it's a foundational bit.
And we saw 2014 how complex that was as well.
Yeah.
Just one thing that happened. It wasn't just one law, it wasn't one thing that were happening around the world. It was it was a complex situation. It was in 1888, and it will be in the future.
Yeah.
Everybody okay? It's great to have our new members with us. If you've got no more questions, I will say a prayer. If you want to kneel with me. Dear Almighty God, we thank you for a wonderful Sabbath. I thank you for the new members. I thank you for being able to come together and discuss your truths. We thank you for the Millerites. We thank you for all the information that we have. We can look back and see how you've led your people from the beginning. It strengthens us, Lord, and we know we are on track, and we're fastly moving towards the Sunday law of Daniel 11. I pray, mighty God, that you will bless your people, those that are awake, continue to bless them and help them understand their responsibility in this movement. Those who are slipping away, Lord, I pray that you will strengthen them, help them to look back and see how we've been led. Pray for all the elders who are elder. Please bless them, give them courage and strengthen them and protect. Pray that you will continue to be with us throughout this Sabbath. Help us to keep it holy and enjoy this rest away from the cares of this world. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today and discuss your word. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Natalie.